Without objection. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I introduce H.R. 5353, the War is Making You Poor Act. The War is Making You Poor Act does three things. First, it requires the administration to carry out the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with only, that's only, the $549 billion set forth in the President's budget for defense spending, without the additional $159 billion the President has asked for the sake of the so-called emergency war, which now stretches on to 9 years in one case and 7 years in the other. My view is that $549 billion is enough for these wars or any other wars the President plans to engage in. What this does, secondly, is that it takes the money that is saved from the war separate allocation, and it uses that for a very important purpose with our economy the way it is and people in America suffering. It takes that money, or 90% of it, and it uses that to make $35,000 of everyone's income in America tax-free and $70,000 for married couples. Let's be clear about that. Let's be clear about what I said. With the money that is being saved by the War is Making You Poor Act, we can give $35,000 of every American's income. We can make that tax-free and $70,000 for married couples. And in addition to that, it takes the remaining money and reduces the federal deficit and the federal debt. I think those are three things, all of which need to be done. This bill brings them all together. Let's start with the fact that the administration has asked for $549 billion to basically keep the lights on at the Pentagon, and beyond that asked for another $159 billion for the wars. Let's see exactly how much that means. On this chart here, you can see that the U.S. military spending is as much as the entire rest of the world combined. As much as the entire rest of the world combined. And in fact, the ones who come in second are our NATO allies in Europe, who I don't expect to be attacking us anytime soon. Beyond that, you have to go all the way down to China to get to any country that is conceivably ever going to be a military enemy, and we outspend China by over 5-1. Beyond that, we get into our allies in East Asia and Australia, and you have to go all the way down to Russia, whom we outspend by almost 10-1, before you get to any country that could conceivably be a military opponent. Why is this necessary? If we're going to have military spending that amounts to this much, half of all the military spending in the world, do we need to have on top of that base budget, another $150 billion for the war? I think not, particularly when people in America are suffering. So I believe that the thing we need to do is to take that $159 billion that the President has set aside. We're not saying he has to stop the war. We're not giving a cutoff date for the war. We're simply saying you need to fund that out of the base budget of $549 billion, and we take 90% of that money and give it back to the American people. And I think most people would be surprised to learn that that is so much money that we've been spending on the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, that every single taxpayer in America will be able to get his first or her first $35,000 of income completely tax-free. You won't see $1 in tax until you make more than that. And in fact, almost a third of Americans don't make more than that, so they will simply be excused from the federal income tax system, and all we need to do is to stop separately funding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I've heard a lot of complaints from the other side and many complaints from people on our side about the federal debt and the federal deficit. Here's something concrete that you can do. If this bill passes, we'll be able to reduce the federal deficit by $16 billion. You don't have to take my word for it. It's already been scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation. The Joint Committee on Taxation staff has determined that the tax cut that's needed to give every single person in America $35,000 tax-free, their first $35,000, would cost less than the wars and would leave over after that another $16 billion. Mr. Speaker, this is an idea whose time has come. It's time for the American people to see that there is no longer any need to go beyond the base, exorbitant defense budget that's presented to us by the President, notwithstanding the fact that there are wars in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq. It's simply not necessary. You can see for yourself, enough is enough. $549 billion is plenty, particularly when we're using the Chinese credit card to pay for it all. So I ask for your support, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that the Chamber will consider the H.R. 5353 War is Making You Poor Act. Thank you very much. I yield.